And you wouldn't like that, would ya? Ha ha!
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the kennel. I'm Foxhound as usual, and joining me today is Stith of the Austin Warrior Arts and the Guild of the Silent Sword. Damon is a practitioner and a carrier-on of the traditions of historical African martial arts, also referred to as Hama. That's what I'm going to say from now on so that I don't keep stumbling over historical African martial arts. Welcome, Damon.
It's okay.
Just did
No,
it.
you're fine. You know what? I went through just a little bit of background that's not martial arts related. So I went through most of my life being called Damon. So a lot of my old friends from like elementary and part of high school referred to me as Damon. But at home I was always Damon. It wasn't until the 11th grade I was like, okay, I'm going by Damon, and there was that paradigm shift. So no, it's all good.
That's cool,
It's an
man.
honor to be here.
Well, I'm very honored to have you on here. Part of why I really wanted to get you on here was you have a great presence on social media. I really love your Instagram, and I love your expressions of movement. And that kind of caught my eye early on. And, I started looking a little bit deeper. I'm a big fan of all the different weapon shapes of the various historical African martial arts that I've seen so far. And getting to see people actually moving with them is really impressive to me. So I don't know, I'm assuming some of my audience might know a bit about it, but some might not. Could you tell us a bit about, the lineages that you train in, and just sort of what is Hama to you?
Okay. Yeah. So that's a great question. So Hama, and we've kind of, as an organization, so there's Hama, the organization, and then there's the concept of what Hama is like, So the organization, we've kind of grappled with the idea of how we categorize like what's historical and what's not historical, and what does that mean for us. And it's a very different thing than for HEMA, or historical European martial arts, where you're dealing with source material in the form of literature, and then you also have like artwork and things of that nature. Unfortunately, as of yet, we don't have a lot of literature, but we do have a lot of living traditions that carry on some of the close quarter style fighting and weapons training that was done by the warriors in the past. So you'll have to forgive me. I'm an old man, and sometimes I'll kind of talk in a circle, then I'll forget exactly what I was supposed to answer. So historical African martial arts, it's a tough thing to answer because most of our understanding of Africa is very skewed. We mostly we think about the Zulus left a very lasting impression in the British mind, as far as like what was a African warrior during the 19th century, and while that was a reality in some states, we kind of think more of light infantry using shield and spear. And we don't think of some of the other like states and kingdoms that were using more, fighting from. Don't necessarily always connect swords with Africa. We think mostly like in terms of spears and stuff. So the first thing is kind of like realizing that some of the earliest documentation of systematic or organized fighting styles that actually can be found on the continent. In ancient Egypt, earliest documentation of stick fighting, wrestling, boxing, archery, and you'll find that throughout the continent, these modalities of training and combat sports are found in many cultures. Stick fighting is, widespread throughout North Africa, especially in East and Southern Africa. Stick fighting is has a very strong roots there. And then the tradition of wrestling is well documented of course, in the Nuba in East Africa, and then in the West, the Lam and Bori from Senegal and Senegambia region is very popular nowadays. But stick fighting, wrestling, these modalities of combat sports and martial arts were documented, in the tombs of Beni Hassan in Egypt, You can fact check me on the years, but roughly it was what Middle Kingdom Egypt, where you had these tombs demonstrating a number of like locks and throws and takedowns that it was not anything that we haven't that we as modern people that we don't see in other grappling forms. What's really impressive is that wow, this scribe, who I'm assuming is not a wrestler, is actually depicting, you know, wrestling techniques that we still use today.
Hmm.
And for me, that's kind of the most like amazing thing to see is that attention to detail, and that that ancient people were were using these well-defined techniques back then. So that's pretty amazing for me. So after we established that, then we start looking for, establishing that there's this tradition of martial arts on the continent. Then it's just a matter of kind of tracing those different arts to their place of origin and learning more about it. So in some cases, we have living traditions that we can find. Sometimes we get descriptions by European explorers who have were part of or witnessing African armies fighting in the field or fought against them. Um, Artwork and forensic or battlefield forensics is what I would like to call this, where you find um, uh, weapons and body parts that kind of give an indication of like how they were injured, what type of injuries they sustained. So it's a very holistic approach
Hmm.
to viewing and especially the reconstructing of African martial arts.
Hmm. Do you find that you run up against a lot of sort of preconceived notions, misconceptions of like, the people thinking that it's like, well, it was like a shield and a spear, like you were saying, the Zulu warriors, because of their interactions with the British, and the movies that were made and everything else is sort of imprinted where, I mean, Africa's a really big place with a really long history. So for I
Yeah,
know with a Eurocentric view that we have in America, even people sort of have these thoughts and ideas. I would almost hope shows like Forged in Fire would have started at this point to break people of that, because people are going to see like, oh, we had these throwing weapons or these swords. Like, well, those sure don't fit the
yeah,
idea. This idea of some kind of person who never got out of like the early Iron Age.
right.
Do you
I mean,
find?
yeah,
Oh,
and I think.
no, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. Go ahead.
No, no,
Go
you
ahead.
go ahead.
So I think you kind of illustrated some of the obstacles that comes from doing this. Is that yeah, there is this preconceived notion that and I'm gonna be quite honest and quite blunt, that like African warriors were stunted in growth and development, and were very far behind their European and Asian counterparts. That's what it kind of boils down to. And
Hmm.
typically, most people kind of venerate the sword. The sword is seen as a symbol of power, a symbol of authority. Even though we know on the battlefield, you know, most cultures relied on the spear and they relied on the shield on the battlefield, and the sword was more of a secondary thing.
Hmm.
But in the African context, it is seen. You'll find people that don't really know that there are African swords, and I think that kind of is symbolic to kind of keeping Africa outside of this circle of heroes and warrior culture that we find on the earth. So that's one of the obstacles. Is just kind of like coming, kind of tackling, tackling this ignorance that is pervasive in our society, and not
Hmm.
just in our society, but just kind of how the world views Africa. What I usually kind of get is the stick thing. Is next to the spear is a stick. So
Hmm.
there was a meme kind of floating around a year or so ago, and it was like it was showing like a Greek sword, and it was I think I may be mixing it up, but it was like an ancient European sword, and then it was like yeah the ancient version, and then it was like the new version or the medieval version. It showed like a long sword or whatever, and
Hmm.
then it did that for a couple of cultures, and then when it came to Africa, it had a stick, you know what I'm saying? And, you know, again, uh that is kind of it's a stick is a anyone that's done stick fighting, and I know you know this, know the stick is a very brutal, very effective weapon, and it's a very inexpensive weapon. You know, when we're talking about, you know, fielding warriors, it's, you know, you'll find sticks being used as late as I think in World War I, people were still using some types
Yeah.
of sticks or maces or clubs or whatever else. So it's like it's definitely not seen as one of those honorable weapons, you know, the weapons of a true warrior culture. But we know that they are effective, and so I think that that's kind of like what I come across is the notion that, oh, that there's African swords, or so I do. You asked me about lineages and what I train. So one of the systems, the living traditions that I train, is machete fencing from Colombia and machete fencing from Haiti. And usually, you know, the default is, okay, well, you got the African slaves, and of course they brought their like stick fighting, and you know, like Africans know how to dance. They brought their like the footwork and stuff from the dance, but then like the blade work, they, you know, copied from like Spanish fencing, or they copied the blade work from French fencing if they're from Haiti. And it's kind of this usually this like this default to edge weapons being a non-African thing and a European thing that's being adopted, as opposed to, you know, realizing that the cultures that were being brought into the Americas were from, you know, the forest kingdoms, the forest areas in West Africa, the forest kingdoms and savanna areas of Central Africa, and they fought with very, you know, with shorter blades that were, you know, the Europeans would refer to as sabers, and sometimes as sabers, but as cutlasses.
Yeah.
And cutlass is a term that they use for like machetes, you know. So it's it's less of a leap for a people to take a short, close quarters hacking, cutting, slashing tool and apply it to an agricultural tool of similar, similar use, than to take, you know, Spanish rapier and then apply it to like using a machete that, you know, you can, of course you can cut with a rapier, but it's still, it's like and it's not to say that there's not any influence there. You know, when cultures interact with each other, there's definitely influence, but it's like it's always a one-sided, you know, cultural exchange, and it also is like at the detriment of any indigenous creation or ingenuity that would have or initiative that would have created the practice. Sorry, it was long answer.
No, that's good, man. And that's something also that we see in Filipino martial arts is that, you know, people sort of harp on that Spanish influence on Filipino fighting. But my, you know, sort of counter to that is, but what about the Filipino influence on Spanish fighting? So
Right.
I think that there's no way to have two cultures come into contact like that, you know, for these intense periods of time and not have it go both ways. You know, and I think that
Right.
it's one of those things that it's disrespectful and dismissive to, you know, write somebody off like that. And the meme about the stick thing was kind of, you know, it was a little funny, but then at the same time, like my smile was like only half of my face, because I was like, I see
Yeah.
what was done there, and that's a fucking disservice, as far as I consider it. I mean, and to take an entire continent's worth of history and to just boil it down to like stick is like
Right.
kind of
Right.
makes me say fuck you a little bit to somebody. But you know,
Yeah.
again, that's part of why I want to talk to you, is because I want people to understand that we're not talking about some group of people that never progressed beyond, you know, living in grass huts or something, and that there wasn't some rich cultural and historical background behind the entire continent of Africa. And the, you know, you mentioned these regions, you know, you talk about the eastern parts of Africa versus the central savannas, the western parts of Africa. These are huge pieces of land with lots of people that are all very different
Diverse.
from one another.
And
Yeah.
so a way that I try to explain this to people too, and I think like as Americans, we don't really understand this. Um, you take a country like Ethiopia, right? Ethiopia is a relatively large country. It has, oh, and I always get it kind of mixed up. It has over 100 different ethnic groups
Hmm.
and 80 different languages and dialects that are spoken within that one country, you know?
Hmm.
And so looking out, we may see it all as being the same or various, varying degrees of differences, but the same. But like within those cultures, the differences are more pronounced, and yeah, it's an extremely diverse place, um, and it's difficult to put it all into one box. It's like unfortunately we're doing that now. This is because we're kind of blazing the trail in a sense, and as we progress, we hope to have more, our knowledge of more specific or more individual groups and more individual regions and time periods to become more in depth. But for now, we're covering everything to kind of like blaze a trail and kind of rally the troops in this area of study.
Absolutely. I think what you guys are doing, both from a martial arts standpoint and from the standpoint of someone for whom history is really important. I'm all about it, man. I'm really anytime I get a chance to see in one of your videos just the idiom of movement, even though like I like to kind of point out to people that when you look at, like, say for me, Filipino martial arts versus historical European martial arts, and you see certain things like what I'd call a roof block to like it would be a parry and riposte kind of thing. I go, oh, that's the exact same thing. You know why? Because we're all human beings, right? Like we all have essentially the same anatomy, and we all have essentially the same parts that are important. So fighting is usually damaging those important parts and or protecting those important parts. So there's sort of
Yeah,
only so many efficient ways to move to do that. But where the
right.
difference lies and the things that make it really interesting from place to place is the what I refer to, I didn't make this up, somebody said it one time and I thought it sounded good, idioms of movement, the way that culturally you'll see people move in
Right.
the knife combatives world right now. You've got Piper, which comes from South African sources, and if you watch those guys, Nigel and Lloyd, who don't like to be mentioned in the same sentence, but I'm gonna, if you watch those two guys move, you go, oh, okay, well, I see what you're doing when it comes to this part. But
Right.
all the other stuff, the shimmer, the passes, the hand stuff, the in and out stuff, that is clearly a cultural system of movement that to outsiders is like, whoa, what's that?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and that's something that I really appreciate, to see a guy moving with a sword in a way that I'm like, oh, I see what you're doing, but I've never seen it like this before.
Yeah. 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 I think that's kind of the thing with with me, because it's like, of course, I haven't just studied what I do.
Of course, yeah.
I have a path before this, and everything that I've done in the past, led up to where I'm at now. And then sometimes it's really frustrating because, and I'll see, and I talk to my students about this. It's like sometimes I don't really know what to do with my hands, right? Because I know, like, if depending on which system I'm doing, like because usually the hands, depending on what it is, the hands are kind of loose, right? Just like
Hmm.
loosely, the hands are doing different things. So like sometimes the hands may be kind of close to the chest here, and it's like I know, it's like, oh man, I was like, they see me do this video, my hands are close, like this is gonna be like, oh, they're just doing Filipino martial arts. And then I'm like, okay, if I hold my hand back behind here, and sometimes in machete when we first starting,
Hmm.
you know, that's how they start beginners with this hand, you know, behind the back, you know, and then okay, so now it's like I'm doing messer or whatever else, and I was doing some shield work, and I did this cut with the shield, and I came back around, across around it in some kind of way, and it was like, oh, okay, and it's like I-31, I-33, excuse me, and it's like trying to find your identity in these systems or movement systems where things are similar, and trying to accentuate some of the cultural, it's like it's two things. It's trying to like accentuate the cultural aspects, the flavoring that makes it, different. But at the same time, like when I do this, I don't do it just kind of as like recreational, just for like the sake of like, doing it. And that's perfectly fine for people to train martial arts for that reason. But, I am a martial artist, and I do want to understand how to be functional with what I'm doing. And granted, I'm not expecting to get attacked by ninjas or, have to deal with the red wedding or anything. I'm a big nerd, so
Yeah,
I
no,
like.
it's all right, man. I got the reference.
Yeah. So but I want to be able to feel like I can. I like the connection that occurs during sparring.
Mhm.
Um, it's a way for me to kind of zone out and kind of like you know it's a way for me to like to be in a moment
Mhm.
and really kind of deal with my. Can I curse?
Absolutely. I
Okay.
do often and loudly.
Okay, so me too. So it's definitely a way for me to kind of deal with my own like personal inner demons in that moment, because I I, I end up fighting with myself. You know what I'm saying? Like I'm doing this battle with myself, and then the person that my partner that I'm fighting with is actually just kind of like a mirror, kind of reflecting these feelings that I feel.
Mhm.
And so I would like for my art to be able to be functional in the sense that I can use it.
Mhm.
So here's one of those circular old man times again. So like I was walking through this and I just forgot all my points. But yeah, so there's a point of functionality, but then that's what it was. So it's just like there's one trying to like show the cultural flavoring of the practice. At the same time, I just want to also just be free as a martial artist to like use the attributes, the skills, and the tools that I've gotten from these practices or these ideas, and to just like be free to express them how they come out, and not have to worry about, oh, if my hand is here, I'm doing Filipino martial arts, or it's back here, I'm doing European, or I'm doing I-33 or whatever. So you know, man, that's kind of like the struggle, the balance that I try to find for myself.
Absolutely. I feel that, man. I feel that. I'm a very eclectic martial artist in terms of the things that I put together. And when I started teaching, I really quickly threw out any preconceived label, because at that point I was like, I'm showing these chunks of all these different things put together. It's not just one thing that already was there. Do you
Yeah.
find though, so we've talked about living tradition sort of versus recreation a little bit. Like you've mentioned sort of both. Um, do you have uh I don't really know how to say it. Well, I guess the first question I think would be, um, do you have different like discrete styles that you follow that are like, all right, this is the traditional art of this area, and then within that, um, do you have a differentiation between armed and unarmed, striking versus
Right.
striking versus grappling, that kind of stuff? Or do you find that these traditions, much like, you could say Filipino martial arts, and it encompasses, the blade, the stick, empty hands, grappling, all these things?
Right. So I think when dealing with me just as the individual, these arts come together
Hmm.
as like Voltron or the Power Rangers or whatever. So it's like um again, it goes back to, I have to respect that even though I'm of African descent, I have to also respect that my individual ethnic and tribal and national, connections I could never just like go back to like, you know, one ethnic group that I belong to, because, you know, the consequences of the slave trade was this intermixing of not only different, African groups, but also a number of African groups with, European and non-European ancestry to kind of create, you know, our situation here. So I have to understand and respect that, although as an insider, but on the outside in a sense, because I'm, you know, I again, my ancestry is from the continent, but I'm not the same as like a person who was born and raised there in the culture. So I have to understand my unique position when
Mhm.
I'm dealing with other people's cultures, even though I'm in some way connected to it in a sense. So gosh, so what I what I always try to do is approach those systems with respect and understand that again, like for the say take like Nguni stick fighting or Donga stick fighting, like these are things that are like part of the culture, and they have like a specific kind of like time and space that they occur. Well, I don't, I'm speaking in broad strokes in that sense. Just to say that Nguni stick fighting and Donga stick fighting is something that's very connected to these specific people, and I don't think what you would find at this point is like the same kind of like cultural like mixing of styles that would happen like between cultures there. Like I think you
Mhm.
would definitely find that like that's something that we would do here, but not really. You wouldn't necessarily find Donga and Nguni stick fighting mixed. You know,
Like you
there.
wouldn't have the top Donga guy go and be like, "Hey, dude, who's good at Nguni? Like, let's fucking have it out." Like you wouldn't have that.
Not well, yeah, not you wouldn't have that necessarily, not yet at least, unless
Hmm.
we're actually thinking about. This is another thing. This is we'll talk about that later. But yeah, so I'm saying like how in specific groups will have specific fighting styles,
Hmm.
but you don't necessarily find that they are all that there's this merging of them together. And I'm speaking more just like in broad strokes.
It
Whereas,
seems.
go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry. I was gonna say
No,
it seems to me from what I've seen of a couple of different kinds of stick fighting, several different kinds of grappling, and then a form of boxing where they had like one hand wrapped up.
combat boxing.
It seems like those things are very ritualized within their space, which you could say the same thing about Dog Brothers style stick fighting. You know what I mean? Like it's ritualized within our
Yeah,
space. So you
yeah,
think that sort of from
yeah. So
community
like,
to community.
yeah, so like I don't think that you will find so like you said, like Dembe boxing is something that was,
Yep.
you know, one time the practice of butchers of the Butchers Guild in Hausa land in Nigeria. And so each ethnic group would have their own type type of combat sport that they preferred and that they did. You know, sometimes they would have multiple ones. Um, but I don't think it would necessarily be like you would necessarily find like, you know, you wouldn't find like, okay, I got Dambe boxing for my empty hands. I got for my long range weapons, I have Donga stick fighting. For my shield work, I'll do Nguni stick fighting. For my knife work, I'll do Piper. And then I got this system that occurs. So you won't find that kind of stuff, I think, on the continent.
Okay.
Um, but and just to going back to answer your question, I went a long way there to get to it. Respecting that these are cultural practices that have a very unique specific significance to the cultures that practice them. Me being on the inside and on the outside, um we do have this pan-African idea within my school, a pan-African idea of martial arts. So like you we will do, you know, empty hand stuff. We will do, you know, wrestling. We will do stick and shield. We will do sword and shield. We will do spear. We'll do long stick. We do short stick. We do machete. And it's under the desire to kind of practice these for um, practice them in a way that's outside of their normal cultural practice, but in a way that's kind of more aligned with what we Westerners expect from a martial art or what we want from a martial art. You know what I'm saying? I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. I mean, I grew up on Chuck Norris and Bruce Lee and Ninja Turtles and all that stuff. I was born in the '80s, so that was
Yeah,
all
yeah.
right around there for me. So that stuff sort of sunk into my head really early on. And, obviously sword fighting, and I was always into Star Wars, so the Jedi and everything. And so for me, um, as a white man, I always had these things to look up to, or like these other cultures that I already thought were cool that I could kind of be like, well, I could be like a ninja, I
Right.
could be somehow Tom Cruise as the Last Samurai.
Right.
But do you think, I'm trying to think of how to say this. Do you think that as an African American, the idea of like you said, Pan-African arts is beginning to come out as something that maybe will give kids, sort of like with Black Panther, like give kids some things to look up to and to kind of be proud of. And even if it's not exactly, listen, I'm about as Irish as somebody doing an accent on TV, but I still have this connection in my mind all the way back there to my Irish ancestors, or
Yeah.
my Scandinavian ancestors that stole a big chunk of England at one point. So I do you think that we're kind of entering into a time, and especially with the internet and the way that things are now, that maybe we're going to
Yeah.
start to see that?
Yeah. So I mean, that's kind of the story of my life. So
Mhm.
I think that now, since we have the internet, and so and communities are more connected, and information is more readily available, you can there's still a lot to learn. There's a lot of misinformation out there, but there's also a lot of really good information out there, and it just takes it takes some time and some desire to do the research and to connect with the people that have the information. But I was going to say, like, I was in the same boat as a kid, just kind of like, I think that kids are going to gravitate to these things that are kind of embedded in us, as a species, that we respect and revere, and that creates a sense of awe and inspires us. Whether that's European, Asian, Middle Eastern, or whatnot. As a kid, I was really into those same things, except for the Ninja Turtles. I was really, I mean, I'm a little older, so I was a bit before that, but I was into the same things. But I do always remember feeling like, man, like it would be really cool to be, a samurai. But damn, they didn't have any black samurais, right? But no one was talking about Yasuke
Yeah,
back
I
in
was
the
gonna say yes, they
yeah,
did.
right.
Yeah,
No one
yeah.
was talking about that stuff in
Mhm.
the 70s and 80s when I was a kid. And I think that that's the difference now, is like we do have more information out there to, even just like, people don't know about, like, Sir Morin and several like black knights that were, mentioned in the Arthurian romances, and the fact that Europe itself was not just this monolithic, you know um place. That there were these, it was multicultural in certain areas and certain aspects, and number of, like, medieval fight books and Renaissance fight books depict African fighters doing historical European martial arts along with
Mhm.
Western counterparts. So the thing is, we just, in those times, we don't have those narratives out there. It's just like, you know. And so that made me feel, at the time as a kid, it made me feel like, I didn't really have anything, like I was really, you know, it made me feel really, made me hate myself and not really appreciate my ancestors. And, when all you're told about is like how, you come from a place that's like, you know, savage and uncivilized, and there's no written history about it. And the only history starts like in the 1800s during the slave trade. And then it's like, okay, you got 400 years of getting your ass kicked, and, you know, on both sides, but no one talks about the numerous, like, slave revolts and slave rebellions and insurrections, and flat out wars that were being fought on this side of the Atlantic and on the other side of the Atlantic. And no one talks about, like, you know there is like, there are over 20 different distinct fighting styles that you can find in the African diaspora, that like includes empty hand fighting, wrestling, weapons, whether it's fighting with a stick, machete, knife. Um, there's a cluster of fighting arts that's found in the diaspora, and and that speaks to the richness of the fighting culture that the people brought with them. And many of enslaved Africans were captured, as a result of wars or on the battlefield, and they
Mhm.
brought that knowledge with them.
Mhm.
They brought their skills either as being able to work with iron or to work with agriculture, or their understanding of fighting in certain types of terrain, animal husbandry. They brought these understandings with them over, and that's what's kind of created, as part of what's created the cultures that we see today. But when we think about slave, or as a kid, when I thought about slavery, it was like, okay, they 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 kidnapped people, brought them across, and once they crossed the Atlantic, and because of the harsh treatment, they lost everything. Everything was lost, and they didn't retain anything, and they're just these empty vessels. And it's like no one is just an empty vessel. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
Um, there's courage that can be found in all the stories, whether it's the people that said, fuck this shit, I'm burning the ship down and I'm cutting people's throats, or I'm jumping in the water, or those that got here and decided to go run away into the, isolated areas to build
Mhm.
communities, or those people who stayed in society and like, okay, I'm gonna figure out how to work this shit out from within. Um, I'm gonna have the courage to, try to like raise children and try to like move us forward. There's courage in all those stories, and it's the thing is we don't really get those stories told. Um, yeah, so
Well, I think we are coming out of an informational dark age. I think we're going through the growing pains of it right now, big time,
yeah,
as a world civilization. But I think, particularly in this country right now, those growing pains, when they're done, are really going to have opened a lot of people's eyes to a lot of things that have been either intentionally, like someone was like, we're just not going to give these people credit, or whether systematically, uh, just the building of the way that things are, kept groups down or whatever. I think a lot of that is breaking up right now, and
yeah,
I'm really, I'm hesitant to be hopeful, but I'm hopeful right now. And I think that a lot of this informational dark age is from lack of communication with one another, and lack of ability to kind of, you know, empathize with, okay, the way that I may have seen the entire world up to this point might have been skewed a little bit. Um, what's it like how you see the world? And to be able to, Anthony Bourdain is one of my big heroes, and he has done that in a major way through food, because everybody eats, right? Like
right,
we only have a couple of universal experiences as human beings. Like the human experience is, is what it is, but we all have to eat.
right,
Um, but I also look at it as none of us got here without some fighting.
right,
Like there's no such thing as, oh, a society that just made it forever without having to fight anybody. Go to
yeah,
the Sentinel Islands. Is that off the coast of Africa near India? Hey man, if you show up right now, those guys haven't talked to anybody in 1,000 years, because if you show up there, they shoot you with arrows.
yeah,
So every culture has some sort of a martial tradition, and in some
right,
places, it's not necessary for them to carry it on as vehemently as in other places, but you have other places that are extremely warlike still. As
right,
Americans, we're pretty warlike. Within
yeah,
the boundaries of our country, um, even our peaceful versus less peaceful people, we're having a little war with ourselves. And within
right,
this country, whether it's words and information, or whether it's, there's people actually physically having altercations right now over our
right,
differences. And I don't know that that particular aspect of humanity will ever go away, but
yeah,
I think being able to understand those things and where we come from and the why we fight and the how we fight can sort of bridge things for people. You'll hear stories of guys during World War I or II that would have, the World War I, the ceasefire at Christmas time, and the Germans and British soldiers playing soccer together, or, there have been more bitter conflicts and, more sort of gentlemanly conflicts throughout history. But something that, it's a cliche if you've read Fight Club, but like, how much do you know about yourself if you've never been in a fight? And one of the things that I say, having fought, I don't know how many people in my adult life, you get to know other people by fighting them, and whether it's their style or their heart or whatever, I think it says a lot about a human being and what's inside them. And it's something that I think is really important just in general.
Yeah. I see. And when you're talking about this is kind of, it reminds me of one of the things that I find that is very distinct about African martial arts. Apart from the techniques and apart from, whatever else, is how these arts like function within their society. The fact that this is, when I say that they're functional arts, like they function on multi levels within the society, and part of that is using these feats of bravery, courage, these acts of controlled and controlled violence. Use these things in order to celebrate different transferences of time or transformations within a person's journey, to pay respect to certain spiritual ideas, to ensure like a bony, not a bony, but a bounty, and I'm forgetting the word I was blending bounty with, but to ensure a bountiful like harvest, to celebrate the passing of certain signs, to entertain people for, predominantly in most cultures, young men, to offer young men a way to demonstrate their courage and strength and bravery and skill to their community, to win a wife, or to, show that to ensure that this person can pass on their DNA or whatever else. These arts would, and this is in modern Africa, but it's also in ancient Africa. The stick fighting and the wrestling were used as to train the soldiers in ancient Egypt, but it was also used to do like these reenactments of the eternal struggle between Set, Horus, and the resurrection of Osiris. And so you have these practices that have these multifunctional purposes. And I think that's kind of one of the, and I think that is how all arts function within their cultures. They have these, they're multi-tiered in a sense. They're not just and I'm again speaking in broad strokes. I should say in some cases they exist as on several levels. And what I find in the African martial arts, that is like is almost a universal thing that I see, is that they exist, for these, just as much for these social practices than for these military practices as well. So
that's really important as well, that there's this cultural tie beyond just, hey, we need to stop these guys from taking our stuff, or hey, we're running low on food, we gotta go take those guys' stuff or whatever. Because that, people don't like to, we live in a time where we're almost embarrassed of past conquests and things that everyone, in some ways it should be things that we look back and we go, ooh, it's some bad stuff. We need to make sure that doesn't happen like that again. But just like every group in the world, everyone's ancestors fought someone at some point. Everyone at some point, was living in that valley over there, and then we had a drought and we had to move or whatever. But to be able to mentally rise above just the necessity of combat, and to consider the cultural aspects, like, you know, the dance and the demonstrations of skill and strength and training for war. I mean, you know, I grew up playing ice hockey and then played rugby as a young man, and I found that those things actually helped a lot when I got into full contact fighting, because
Yeah.
there's some aspects of war in those things.
Games.
And you know, the attitude that you have to develop to play a rough game directly helps in hand-to-hand combat. You know, not everyone that plays a sport sees it that way. I did, because I was a pain in the ass. But ice hockey, generally everyone sees it that way. That's a real sport full of angry people that incur head injuries really early on. But it's because you're going 25 miles an hour, man. It's car crashes. But but yeah, no, it's that I'm very interested in the fact that you bring up the cultural parts of things, and that sort of ties into the living tradition side of things as well. You know, when there's parts of the Philippines that when the Spanish were there, you know, they banned any kind of fighting, so they had to turn it into dance because they had to hide it. But what you're talking about is more the outright celebration of the fighting arts, and that's something that I think is really neat. That's something.
Can I take your platform for a moment to
please,
use the platform
please do
because that's a really good point, and I wanted to talk about probably one of the most famous African based martial arts out there, and I would go so far as to say, because of the success of this art, I think that it has aided in revitalizing the sister arts that were practiced around it, as well as brought a lot of attention to the idea of African martial arts. And I'm talking about capoeira. Capoeira is that the interest in capoeira has, you know, again, I feel like fueled the resurgence of many Afro-diasporic fighting arts, and has helped to kind of maintain it, because a lot of them were on their way like out and, you know, dying out. And one thing about capoeira, I want to say this, and I will probably get into trouble about this, but so that's kind of my base as far as a young teenager. Capoeira was my gateway into African martial arts. I have a whole like Only the Strong story to tell.
I was just gonna start going banana way.
Yeah. That was my that was what got me into African martial arts, because that was the conclusion. It was like, okay, well, you know, capoeira. Well, first off, just dealing with how it's how it was created, right? So typically when we're talking about capoeira, it's like, oh, okay, man, it was like the enslaved Africans, they were enslaved, and they like wanted to fight against their oppressors. So what they started to do is they started to create this like fighting style, but like they had to, like, you know, they couldn't do, because they're slaves, they couldn't fight openly. So they had to like make it look like a dance. They start throwing these like flips in, and they add music, and they add singing, and they add all this stuff into it. And then all of a sudden it's like, you know, you have this art, right? So I'm glad we talked about like how the majority, or a lot of African martial arts exist on the continent, being celebratory, you know, being these multifunctional, multi-genre activities. Establishing that is already as a baseline. Capoeira wasn't disguised as it wasn't a fighting art disguised as a dance. It was very clearly described by Rugendis, who was like in the 1840s, 1850s. And I could be completely off on that date. Don't you guys fact check that and make fun of me if I made a mistake. But I think it was 1849. I could be wrong. But he did a drawing of two guys doing capoeira, And he mentioned the activity as being like a violent activity, very overt violent activity that often escalated into more violence, with knives and stuff being drawn and stuff like that. You don't have this idea of this picturesque, really cool, just chilling dance, what I'm saying, that, acrobatic dance, that that's later kind of associated with the art. And I think the thing is that you have that as kind of a folk etymology for the roots of the art, because it is a common way oppressed cultures and diaspora, and especially in the diaspora, how we manage to maintain our practices is by hiding it in plain sight, disguising it, altering it in certain ways. And I'm not to say it didn't happen with capoeira, but I'm just saying that it was never just this. It was never like, hey, I fooled you guys. We're only dancing. It's not a fight. We're not fighting. We're not doing anything violent. We're just dancing. I don't think that was ever the case in capoeira's history. The Brazilian government always recognized that capoeira was the capoeiristas were a physical threat and a nuisance to their society, and that the practice had was a violent practice, and that they, and some people don't know this, right? Is that when in Brazil, when they were trying to craft like a national identity, especially when there were a large number of immigrants and European powers that were flexing the muscles. The Brazilian government was looking for a national fight to kind of be their champion, and capoeira was one of those that was considered. It was rising at the same time as Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, and a lot of back and forth between these two groups. Some famous fighters were lucha libre fighters and capoeiristas, or there's this interaction between Gracie Jiu-Jitsu or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and capoeira that happened in these early Vale Tudo matches. And I think that when we think about it, we only think about it like as this dance fight game, and now realizing that in the past it had a very, very dark and kind of like almost like a Savant-esque style history, where it's associated with like ruffians and I won't say street huff thugs, but like it has this darker.
I was gonna say, like, it sounds almost like it developed as almost like a street style, or like kind of the sort of thing that would happen when a fight broke out, rather than just being this ritualized, two guys doing these really beautiful, almost synchronized. It's cool to see two guys that are really good flowing, because even if they haven't choreographed it beforehand, like, they know when something fits.
It's like it's a vocabulary thing.
But also, if you've ever seen one of those kicks land for real on somebody, that looks like that really hurts. It is not good. I've never had someone connect with one on me, but I've been close. I've been close, and I'm like, oh, that's not good. But it's very I think partially when modern people think about things like capoeira as being a dance that was hidden from the oppressors, it hid the indigenous style from the oppressors, or something like that. Like, it has a very romantic feel to it, and it allows people to almost take some of the teeth out of it, and fit it into a modern context a little bit more, because it might have been Rory Miller that I first heard this from, but the martial arts is the manufacturer of corpses and cripples. It's not, when you're really talking about fighting to defend your life, or fighting for whatever other reason, if we're not friends beforehand, if we just decide to either have a social interaction fight, like we're angry at each other and we're going to have the monkey dance, and that we could all script out, you know what I mean? But actually down to life and death violence, which is where most of these things came from, regardless of how we're able to ritualize them later on. I think a lot of people want to kind of, pretend that that's not the case, that this noble the idea of like Aikido and the redirecting of the force, and like, oh yeah, you redirect that guy face first into the ground is what you're doing.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
don't,
Exactly.
I think that might be something. And was it Mark Dacascos in the Only the Strong? I can't remember who the
Yeah.
guy
Mark.
was. It was
Yeah.
Mark Dacascos. I love that guy. But you
He
know,
was my
that
first teacher.
that did a very big service to capoeira by getting it out there. I knew what it was when I was a teenager growing up like north of Boston.
Right.
Um,
That is the reason why, like, I'm standing here right now
Mhm.
is, you know, I saw that movie, and I just said this kind of under my breath a few moments ago. I was like, that was my first capoeira teacher. Was Martin Cousins. I mean, for real, like, like when I saw the movie, and they didn't really talk too much about the history, and it was Mark DeCasas, but it was more importantly, it was Mestre Amin Santos and the Brazilian group, and
Mhm.
seeing them do it, and seeing that connection, even though it didn't go deep into the history of it, or even into the origins of it. But I was like, oh wow, because I was like, at the time I was kind of like on this JKD kind of path, and I was like, oh wow, um, I kind of like this. I don't know if it's a very functional art, but I like the movement. I like what I like that. I really really liked it. So I started like Bananawe, and and I'm pronouncing it wrong on purpose just to
Yeah, yeah.
to be light. Actually the song is Paranawe, and
Okay.
and it's kind of funny because everyone knows like Bananawe, right?
Yeah.
They don't know what it means. And I was the same thing as a kid. I was
Yeah,
just
no, I have no
finding
idea.
my way and trying to figure out, looking up, trying to figure out what this song meant, and really, really interested. And so I came across um, this guy, and he actually kind of enlightened me to what Paranaway meant, what they were singing about. And so there's a river in between Brazil and Paraguay, and there was this bloody war. So it's called the War of the Three Kingdoms, the three states, and it was basically, or three empires. It was like three South American countries against Paraguay. So Brazil, Argentina, and I believe Uruguay, and they were all teamed up to fight against Paraguay. And this was like this war had some of the highest casualties in Latin America for death casualties is redundant casualties in any war in Latin America. And so during this time, the Brazilian government offered to free slaves, the enslaved Africans, if they went to go and fight. So then you hear them singing about going to fight in this war. They're going to cross this river, the Paraná River. So in the song it's Paranawe. So that's kind of where they're heading to, and they're going to cross this river. And there's this guy talking about different aspects of that. And so, it's like this really kind of like, uplifting, like, oh, okay, yeah, we're gonna go over there, we're gonna fight for our freedom and, get free and all that kind of stuff. But then there's like a darker like undercurrent to this whole story. Because at the time, the capoeiristas were um, they were organized in certain places, they were organized in these paramilitary groups, they were called like Maltas. And these Maltas were like, they were like, I, I don't want to call them gangs, but they were like, they were paramilitary organizations, um, and they leveraged power. They fought against each other. They fought against, the imperial Brazilian soldiers, and were even fought against like a Hessian and Irish mercenary uprising in Rio.
Hmm.
But they were like, they were seen as like kind of like a scourge of the city, um, and they wanted to get rid of the capoeiristas.
It
So
almost
one of the
sounds
ways,
like Italian condottieri, sort
mhm,
of.
yeah, yeah. So they persecuted these organizations. Many of the people, like, this is like some Star Wars shit. It's like, Order 66 is like Some of the main government officials that were like persecuting the art, some of the high up in Brazilian elites were actually practitioners of capoeira. Some of the earliest manuals written about the art are actually police manuals and military manuals. Um, and so they were trying to like eradicate this art, you know. And one way that they did this, in particularly in Bahia, in northeastern Brazil, they sent over the capoeiristas to the front lines in this battle, in this war, particularly in the Battle of Paranauê. And they were fighting in these like trench warfare in these battles where they had this highest casualty. So very few of them came back from the war. So it was like one way that you harness these people's skills and abilities at fighting at close quarters. At the same time, it's also a chance for you to like get rid of this like public nuisance by doing that. And so like when you sing that song, when people sing that song, when I sing the song, it always reminds me of this dual nature of capoeira and how it always reminds us of this inherent sense of like mindfulness of treachery and being able to like navigate against like treachery and being able to find and use treachery to help navigate a treacherous world. And like, so when you look at that, it's really dark, but it's also like it really reflects the situations that the enslaved Africans found themselves, you know, in societies like Brazil, where, you know, hey, it's like, you know, we're going to give you Christianity, you're going to be Christians, but, you know, we're going to rape your daughters, rape your mothers, you know, as good Christians, you know. So you're dealing with this, and that's kind of like what shapes the movement and the interaction in the art, because the art is not is as we have it today. It's kind of like this social commentary in a sense. It can be social commentary, at least how we deal with power and deal with force, which is why we don't directly deal with force. We deal with force by rolling with it, by blending with it, by evading it, by tricking it. That kind of is the aesthetic that's kind of built up in the art today. Um, so it's just kind of, it reflects the environment in which, you know, so it reflects the environment that the art was uh, germinated and developed in. But these systems are rooted in the practices and the warfare styles from Central Africa, where and I'm kind of flipping, kind of like going back now to the continent, because that's kind of how my awareness went. It's like, okay, so like once I got past capoeira as being like this uniquely Brazilian phenomenon, it's like, who in what world do you say, okay, I'm gonna take tap dancing, I'm gonna take ballroom dancing, I'm gonna take break dancing, and I'm gonna take voguing, and I'm gonna put this all in a blender, and then I'm gonna make a fighting art out of all these dancing arts, right? It's like, it's not. I mean, a person that does tap would have phenomenal footwork, right? You'd have phenomenal footwork as a tap dancer, but you know, it's kind of backwards to think about this as being a non-violent practice as dances that were kind of like converted into fighting arts, as opposed to these were fighting arts that had their ritual place at a certain point in time, and because of the pressures of society and the need to evolve and to grow and to survive, it adapted and adjusted in order to meet those needs. And that's kind of what you find in capoeira, is that it was illegal. It was not illegal to practice this. This was the thing that was seen, and it was encouraged in certain ways. And a lot of African practices were encouraged in Brazil because it helped to maintain these national identities between enslaved populations. You had Nago, you had Ketu, you had Hausa, you had, you know, Malay, you had, you know, Yoruba, you had all these groups, the Kumi, all these groups that were kind of there, and it helped to maintain these individual ideas when it didn't, you know. And what was really scary is that, you know, Brazil has like the largest, you know, it has a population of people that are of African descent that are larger than many African nations. So you have this large, enslaved African population. So of course, you're going to do things to kind of either help people just kind of blow off steam that you're not worried about, and at the same time, it helps keep the friction between the groups, and it doesn't let them kind of like, hey, join up and fight against you.
It's almost like it kind of continued to foster the rivalries that would have existed on the other
Exactly.
side of the ocean. Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
Huh.
yeah. So, but the practice of the art, like I was saying, is so that's kind of where I started. Like, okay, well, if it's not, once I realized that this was not a, this was it was capoeira is unique to Brazil, but the idea of these fighting arts being found in other communities in the African diaspora isn't very unique, because you find them in Cuba, you find it in Puerto Rico, you find it in Colombia, Venezuela, Haiti, Dominican Republic, North America. You find it in these areas. And if that's the case, then like, well, capoeira is part of this like larger cultural migration. Well, where does all this stuff come from? So then we start looking to the other side of the Atlantic. And what we find is that so far that Central Africa played a big role in shaping the martial identity of the fighting arts you find in the African diaspora. So there's a really good book on warfare in the Western Atlantic by Professor John Thornton, and he talks about the different styles of warfare and how the terrain and environment and material affected like what type of warriors or what type of soldiers were used. So like in the savannah, northern savannas, it was open country. There was no Tessie fly. It allowed for these large armies of cavalry. So then you have large armies of cavalry that are fighting in armor using sword, shield, spear. In some places where it's densely forest, they wouldn't fight with longer weapons. There were Tessie flies, so you couldn't raise horses. So they fought on the ground in close quarters with shorter weapons. Some places were on the coast, they had access to guns. They adapted gun culture pretty early. So it just kind of breaks down like each region and kind of how, what the circumstances were for their development.
What was the name of the book one more time? I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off.
No worries. It's Warfare in the Western Atlantic by John Thornton.
Warfare in the Western Atlantic. All right, excellent. Sorry about that.
No
That's really interesting.
Yeah. So then when he was talking about Central African warfare, which took on a very interesting, a very unique character, and the way that it's described in his book and in a few others dealing with martial culture in Central Africa, the majority of the soldiers were light infantry, and they fought without a shield. And the shields bearing warriors were considered like the elite warriors, but for the most part, most were light infantry when weren't using shield. And like there's references to a Jesuit missionary that was in Central Africa at the time, and I don't remember the exact kingdom that they were visiting, but they described certain like war dances that were used or that were being done to prepare for war and to like celebrate, kind of like as like a military review. And one of these practices was called the Nsanga. And the way he described it, Nsanga was like, it was a dance of 1,000 like twists, turns, leaps, and contortions, turns of the body, and that this was like they would use this as a means for avoiding, attacks used by projectile weapons, whether it's spear or bows, or for close quarter weapons, whether it's clubs or war hatchets or swords and whatnot. So you have this idea of corporal dexterity being developed by the individual fighter, because of the way the warriors were deployed, they weren't fighting in these like mass, these mass shield walls or whatever else. They fought in these like loose, open rank skirmishing lines. And so the opening parts of the battle would consist of projectiles. They would like throw spears or they shoot bows. And so for a group of shieldless warriors, having these loose lines allowed for personal maneuver to dodge these things and to avoid these things.
Okay, so rather than holding up the shield and chilling, they're moving
They're
around to
dodging and
not get
moving.
hit. Okay.
Right, right. And then so once that phase of the battle was passed, they will close into close quarters and they will fight,
Hmm. Like a
in close
melee.
quarters.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then again, they're at that point, their ability, what is the word? Their success relied not on the cohesion of a group shield, a
Hmm.
group of shield wall or whatever, but it relied on personal maneuver. So they
Hmm.
developed this idea of corporal dexterity, of dynamic evasion. So now you see this type of stuff carry over into capoeira, which is the extreme of that, in a sense that that's where they developed this idea of, you know, not even like, blocking, checking, but trying to use as much as
Hmm.
little, really trying to blend
Right.
with these movements. So that was one of the rituals, one of the ways that they trained the warriors. Another way was the Ngolo dance, which was empty-handed. It had an opening phase that involved slap boxing, and this is kind of where some of the boxing traditions, the open hand boxing traditions, come into the Americas, and you get the development of arts like 52 blocks or uh, knocking and kicking. I think more knocking and kicking was more connected to the less about the what they call kandeka, which is the slap boxing, but more connected to the ngolo portion, which was the kicking and
Hmm.
sweeping and headbutting portion. But like you see that this was how the younger boys would do the open hand slap boxing in the opening, and then you go into the ngolo, which involved the kicking and using dynamic evasions and doing these inversions. And these inversions were seen as ways of referencing and connecting with the netherworld, which was viewed as inverted, was seen as upside down. So that's why in arts like capoeira, you have all these inverted movements. It's not because they're just like showboating, but it's not just because they want to like, oh, master's coming, let me go do a cartwheel real quick, so they don't think that I'm like actually trying to fight this guy. No, they're actually referencing, Central African spirituality by coming into these inverted states. So if you kick from an inverted position, it was seen as a spiritually superior position because you were actually drawing from your ancestors.
Right.
Um,
Oh wow.
Yeah. So there's a really great book that your listeners should check out on that kind of encapsulate all of this and has cite sources. It's Professor T.J. Obi's book, Fighting for Honor, and it lays out everything I just said about African martial arts, especially the fighting arts in the African diaspora, and kind of how they came over, how they were brought over, and how they developed. So that check out his work. He has that's one of his main books on the subject.
Fighting for Honor, it's called. And it was
Yeah, Fighting for Honor.
TJ
TJ
Dash. What was the last part of
Obi.
it? Obi.
Um, OBI. Yeah.
Obi. Yeah. All right. Cool. That does sound kind of
Yeah.
interesting as well. I'm learning a lot right now, man. I'm writing down my notes and stuff, and I'm like, I don't know if you can tell. So my webcam is here, but my monitor is here, which is
Okay.
why it seems like I'm not looking at you. But
Yeah. Yeah.
I've been like completely enthralled. All the stuff that you just said about capoeira, I mean, I knew so very little aside from what I said, like, oh, it's like a dance that hides the fighting. Haha. Like, oh,
Well,
the story of the Pananoe, and that battle and kind of what they were doing with the different groups of capoeiristas, like just that little bit of history that I learned in those couple of minutes has made me be like, oh, I need to know
and
more
just
now.
and just to be fair, I think you were talking about Kali when you mentioned that, and that's what actually sparked
Mm-hmm.
this, because that's usually the connection that's made between capoeira and Kali,
Mm-hmm.
is that shared, and there is an aspect of that did happen, I think, um, when capoeira was eventually it was illegal, and you had some serious, you were beaten and thrown in jail or exiled, from the country. And there was like some severe consequences to doing capoeira at a certain period of time. And when you had like in the 20s and 30s, you know, mestres that were trying to, you know, trying to fight for capoeira to be one, socially accepted, and to be, you know, to be a cultural practice. Um, there were certain concessions I think that happened with allowing that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that part of the reason why the capoeira we have now is very, I don't want to say tame, because you go to different parts of Brazil or different groups and they play, you know, they play pretty hard. But why there's this kind of like, there's this, this I don't say non-martial aspect to it, but there's a difference. Like I think, I guess why there's, you don't see a lot of hand strikes or you don't see a lot of contact. Why it appears more choreographed, or sometimes guys are kind of far apart from each other. I think that this is just my personal theory. I think that when they were fighting for capoeira to become legal and to become accepted in society, part of it was they needed to take away some of that. They needed to make it less of a violent activity and make it more something that was, you know, had to fight. It's like everybody they want it all, right? They want Mr. Miyagi, right? They want, you know, a dude that's like, you know, real chill, but he can put you down,
Yeah.
you know, by doing very little. So that's kind of like, yeah, it's like it's a fight, but it's like it's clean, it's refined, it's non-violent in a sense.
Mm-hmm. It's almost harmonious. I think there's an aspect of that people gravitate to because we watch a lot of movies, you know, or even before that, you know, people read books about these heroic people, and nobody wants to hear about the times that Miyoto Musashi jumped his opponent, like while his opponent was drunk the night before the fight, kind of stuff. You know what I mean? Like people don't want to hear that. They want to hear about the fact that he was this undefeated swordsman or anybody, you know what I mean? But when it comes to the reality and the rubber hitting the road, there's some uglier aspects to it. So I think just anybody wants to see themselves as the good guy. And I think as a human being, at least in the Western world, I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but like we kind of almost vilify the trickster and the brutal guy now. You know what I mean? Where like, I mean, I guess Loki is getting his due again in Marvel, but you have to remember, you know, especially people have, there's like the group of people that were like, you know, Loki is also a girl now. Well, if you know anything about Norse mythology, sometimes Loki turned into a girl. He usually did it to cheat on a bet or to like trick a bunch of people and then murder them. So like you take the two things like, oh, you know, Loki was pansexual, transgender, whatever, and you can see that as a good thing, but then you go, oh, what was he doing with it? So we just kind of, we have this tendency, I think, to want things to be like, well, the good guys wouldn't have done it that way, you know, and the evil guys, the bad guys were the ones that were brutal, and it was this, you know, the idea of the rebellion or the whatever, and it's just nothing's that clean, you know, nothing's that clean. But I think this this ability to take a look back and to begin to pull out, you know, the cultural aspects and to be able to look at the way that it's shaped, any art has shaped the group of people that practice it. You know what I mean? And these things that you've talked about, the Caribbean especially, and the machete fighting, and it's absolutely, I think in Jamaica they still call a machete a cutlass. There's that came from the cutlass. That's where, you know, that that idea of the machete being a sword is because that's what you'd be doing with it. Yeah, you can cut sugar cane, you can clear a path in the jungle, or whatever, but you know, when it comes down to it, those two items are extremely similar, the cutlass and the machete. So you know, to have these things, even if even if you take the Caribbean arts and capoeira and kind of think of them as like the new world, those are historical African arts.
Yeah.
Those are arts that are historically used by people of African descent, regardless of where they were, you know, and their circumstance at the time. Man, this stuff is I already kind of knew by talking to you today that you were going to open some doors in my mind, but I didn't realize which ones, and I didn't realize how much, man. I really appreciate you coming on here with me today, and I really appreciate just taking your time and sharing your knowledge. And I already look forward to getting my hands on those 2 books. I'm about to be traveling for a little bit, and I'm gonna need some reading material. So I'm gonna see if I can get my hands on either of them digitally, and if not, I'm gonna order them and make sure that they're here for me when I get back.
Yes.
Now, can you just tell the folks where they could find you if people would like to look
Yeah.
you up and either train with you or talk to you or just check out your social media?
Yeah. And so I have a website. It's called silentsword.org. You can go and see. I'm terrible at keeping it updated, but I do have some videos and I do have a little bit of a breakdown and about me and kind of what we do. Other than that, my YouTube page is just my name, Damon Stith. I have a lot of videos that I shoot, like either for class, and we're kind of just going over different stuff, different. So I wanted to distinguish between, just real fast. So we do like living traditions, and then we do recreated stuff, things that are kind of based off of whatever information we have to help us understand what this was. So, you know, take Egyptian stick fighting or Egyptian wrestling or whatever else.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're using Egyptian sources, pictorial sources, and then we're cross-referencing that with, you know, contemporary societies contemporary with ancient Egypt, and then living traditions that are found around the area, and then that's kind of how we're basing our reconstruction. So,
Mm-hmm.
I usually, what I try to do is I try to root myself in a living tradition as my practice, but with the desire to excel within that living tradition, whether that's capoeira, whether that's eskrima con machete, tir machete. I've been doing moringi, kickboxing, via virtual. You know, so the idea is to try to excel within the cultural aspect of the art. At the same time, the second idea is to be able to be functional outside of the cultural aspect, so we can have conversations with other people who come from different systems from us. So,
Mm-hmm.
I can use my Colombian machete, and I can interact with Filipino FMA practitioners, or I can interact with German Messer fighters or Dusak fighters, or and that's kind of how we try to approach things. So we do living traditions that form the foundation of what we study, and then these living traditions allow us to do skillful reconstruction based off of whatever evidence we have, and then whatever fighting skills we've developed by doing these living traditions. Just to kind of, I don't know if I said that throughout before, just to kind of put that out there. Anyhow.
No, that's awesome, because that actually answers the question that I sort of posed like an hour ago, and we just kept going off every time a new topic would come. So there you go. It came right back. It came right back in the circle.
That was on purpose.
That was great, man. I like that. You guys
can come and get it at the end.
I like that.
But yeah, so social media. So YouTube page, Damon Stith is a great way to go. Mm-hmm. I have an Instagram page that's also Damon Stith, but it's ran together all as one word. If you do a search on African sword or African martial arts, it'll reference a video or something that I've done that'll connect to social media. Facebook, I've been kind of quiet on Facebook lately, but it's my name, Damon Stith. And then we have our HAMA website, which is Historical African Martial Arts Association.org. .wordpress, excuse me, where you can find updates about what we're doing as an organization. So I founded the organization HAMA Maybe I guess technically it's been about 7 years unofficially, just kind of getting together the council. And so now, we're beginning to be, we're an international organization right now. So it's kind of exciting.
Awesome.
So,
Awesome.
and I serve as president on that. So if you go to the Hama WordPress and then Hama's YouTube page, you can find videos from other council members and other practitioners who are doing the same work. Yeah,
Do you teach a physical in-person class in your area?
I do. We're just now getting our in-person classes going. We're meeting on Tuesday and Thursdays, 6 to 7:30 right now, and then Sunday mornings, and then Sunday evenings. Sunday mornings at 10:30 to 11:30, and then evening times 6 to, what are we doing now? 6 to 7 on Sundays. So
Cool.
more classes soon, and we're still doing virtual as well. The plan is to continue doing virtual as well as doing in-person classes. So yeah, just keep pushing forward.
Outstanding, man. Outstanding. Well, Damon, thank you again so much for coming on here, man, and opening up my eyes to some things that I was aware were out there, but I didn't have any real clue of the breadth of the topic. So I appreciate it a lot, man, and I hope one day we get to move around together a little bit. I think that
Yes,
would be a
sir.
great,
Yes, sir.
great
Yes, sir.
treat
That
for
would be
me.
really cool. That'd be really cool.
All right. Well, thank you again, and thank you all for listening. This was awesome for me, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. Seacrest out.